Hey, what's up, YouTube fans? So the topic of this video is the evolutionary reducibility of the human respiratory system, right? So showing that the human respiratory system can be broken down into a long series of evolutionary steps, each advantageous in its own right. So first, the human respiratory system is nearly identical to that of our closest living relatives, the chimpanzees and bonobos. However, one aspect of the human respiratory system that's unique is we have a unique nose with a bony nasal protrusion, and the bony nasal protrusion, the evolution of it is thought to most likely be a adaptation helping with breathing regulation when walking and running on 2 feet. But it's not like our ancestors wouldn't have been able to survive before they evolved the bony nasal protrusion. Some people have broken noses and they still can survive. And chimpanzees and bonobos, even though they do not have a bony nasal protrusion, they still can survive, they still can breathe, and their respiratory system is otherwise mostly identical to ours. And then next, the ancestors of all mammals evolved a diaphragm and an epiglottis, right, which both help with the respiratory system. So the diaphragm, which is found in all mammals, including humans, it helps with contracting and relaxing the lungs, right? And the epiglottis helps with stopping us from choking because it stops food from going down the wrong tube, right? But neither of these organs had to exist from the beginning in order for our ancestors to have a fully functional respiratory system, because there are other creatures such as birds which have neither of those organs. Birds have neither an epiglottis nor a diaphragm, right? But they still manage to, their respiratory system still works through alternative means, right? Without either of those organs. And that's in spite of the fact that birds, like us, they breathe through the same passageway as they eat through. And they also, like us, they don't have gills, so they can only breathe with their lungs, right? But they still manage, their respiratory system still works just fine through alternative means without need for a diaphragm or an epiglottis. And then next, mammals, reptiles, and birds are all part of a larger clade called the amniotes, right? And early amniotes began no longer having gills, right? And so all amniotes don't have gills. The reason for this change is most likely that early amniotes most likely became, for the first time, fully terrestrial, meaning fully living on land. And this would have been allowed for when amniotes evolved amniotic eggs, which are a unique type of egg to amniotes. That's something I talked about when I talked about the evolutionary reducibility of the reproductive system. Amniotic eggs can only be laid on, amniotic eggs can be laid on land, right? Whereas the types of eggs that are laid by amphibians and fish can only be laid in water, right? And so evolution of amniotic eggs is most likely what allowed for early amniotes to become fully terrestrial, and therefore they lost their gills, right? And now no amniote has gills, even the whales, which have fully returned to the water. And so it would make logical sense for them to have gills, but as a result of their evolutionary history, like all amniotes, they do not have gills, only lungs, right? And so furthermore, evidence that amniotes evolved from creatures that had gills is that during embryonic development, all amniotes start out with a series of what's called pharyngeal arches and pharyngeal slits, and these are very similar in structure to gills, and fish embryos start out with the same exact structures, but for them, it actually goes on to develop into their gills, whereas for us, it more so rearranges and changes further into our development and becomes entirely different structures, right? And yet still derived from the same embryological structure, right? Okay, and then next, early tetrapods evolved a choana, either early tetrapods or our last common ancestor with the lungfish, because the lungfish also has this, but it's debated whether or not they evolved this independently, right? But the early tetrapods evolved either early tetrapods or early rhipistidians evolved a choana, which is a connection between the nasal passage and the pharynx, allowing for breathing through the nostrils, right? But the nostrils already existed before that. Most fish have nostrils, but most fish cannot breathe through their nostrils. They can only smell through their nostrils, just as we also use our nostrils for. And so the nostrils can have evolutionary purpose before they're ever used for the respiratory system, because they can start out just being used for the olfactory system, the sense of smell, and that's still enough for them to have evolutionary advantage. Only later was the choana connection evolved, allowing for them to also be used to be breathed through, right? And then next, so it didn't have, with the evolution of the lungs, right, it didn't have to be a immediate switch from gills and no lungs to lungs and no gills. There would have been an in-between time, right, where our ancestors had both lungs and gills, right? And there still are creatures like this. Most amphibians in their early stages of development have gills, but then later develop lungs. And the lungfish, they have both lungs and gills. And the lungs, when they first were evolved, they did not have to originally be paired as they are now in us. Some lungfish have only one lung, right? And that still works for them, right? And the evolutionary origin of the lungs, right, is that they were evolved through means of modification of the embryonic gut tube, right? So embryologically, the way that we get the lungs as well as the trachea and bronchi is that they are derived from the embryonic gut tube, just as the pharynx and esophagus, stomach, small intestine, and large intestine all are. We originally start out with a gut tube that doesn't have any of these specialized regions. Only later into development do differing regions of it specialize into differing purposes, giving us these various organs. This is also something I talked about when I talked about the evolutionary reducibility of the digestive system. So then this is also how we get the trachea and bronchi and lungs from this same embryonic structure, specialization of this same embryonic structure, right? And so modification of the embryonic gut tube is how our ancestors originally evolved the trachea and bronchi and lungs, right? And then next, for the evolution of the gills, right, which we no longer have, but our ancestors originally did, So it originally most likely would have started with the evolution of pharyngeal slits, which originally didn't have respiratory purposes but would have only been used for filter feeding. Evidence towards that is that some fish still use their gills for filter feeding, as do cephalochordates, and some cephalochordates do, and some hemichordates do. They use the pharyngeal slits for filter feeding, so that can be the original purpose of them. Only later do they become modified into gills by evolving unique blood vessel connections to them that allow for them to be used for oxygen intake. And then before that, our ancestors had no respiratory system, just as still is the case for the most primitive animals alive today, like flatworms and jellyfish and sponges. They all have no respiratory system, but they still manage to survive and reproduce through alternative means with no need for a respiratory system. And this is how it was in the earliest animals, right? With the respiratory system then only later being evolved, right? And so there you guys have it. That's a basic summary for the evolutionary reducibility of the human respiratory system.